welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're looking at one of the most controversial and argued about parts of the New Testament, in which Jesus gives a much debated response to a nasty trick question. Before we get started on that, however, if you've not done so already, you may wish to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 15 through to 22. Today's action continues our journey through everything Matthew groups together on what we now call the Monday of Holy Week. Jesus was in the temple courtyard and was teaching the crowds. He'd been confronted by the chief priests and elders, and having dealt with their question about his authority with a powerful question of his own, he then told a series of 3 parables that really got to the rub of what was going on and held the chief priests and elders to account. That covers chapter 21, verse 23, all the way through to chapter 22, verse 14. Now, it's likely that among the people described as the elders, there were some of the Pharisees and scribes who had been there when Jesus first arrived into Jerusalem and confronted him about the things the crowd was saying and his overturning the tables in the temple courtyard. And they were working, it seems, with some of the Herodians, so a really unlikely pairing, trying to challenge Jesus where the chief priests and elders as a group had failed. They now, it seems, stepped up to have a go themselves. Now, it's important, if we're going to make sense of this passage, to have a little bit of historical background. Since the year 63 BCE, when the Romans occupied Palestine, all men, women and slaves had to pay a tribute that was called a head tax to the Roman emperor in Roman coinage. And this was a deeply contentious thing. A guy called Judas of Galilee had led a revolt in the year 6 of the Common Era, and that had resulted in being brutally put down by the Romans. It saw many crucified bodies left scattered around the countryside as a warning: if you defy Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. So this payment of the tax to Rome was a really controversial issue, which would have been incredibly emotive, would have aroused really strong feelings among the populace. And I think that's why it becomes the focus of the question that's put to Jesus in this passage. Now, obviously, we have Jesus in this text who was entering the final stage, not just of his public ministry, but of his earthly life, and dealing on this day, as I say, with a whole collection of controversies. And indeed, there's more to follow after today's passage. The Pharisees, one of the major groups within Judaism, objected, because of how they understood the holiness laws, about collaborating with foreign rulers, and therefore they objected to paying the Roman tax. And they were among the many who were drawn into an out-and-out rebellion over this that commenced in the year 66 of the Common Era and eventually led to the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70. We've also got a much more difficult group to pin down called the Herodians, who were probably followers of one or other of the various Herods who'd been kicking around and been the puppet rulers of Judea through a lot of that period. They accommodated Roman rule and even argued that the emperor should be able to provide sacrifices to be used in the temple's worship. So you really have polar opposites. You have Roman collaborators in the Herodians working with people who objected to having to pay this tribute tax, that they would eventually be involved in violent rebellion. A real unholy alliance coming together. In the midst of all of that, looking on presumably, you have these crowds of people who were there to listen to Jesus teach and have perhaps been drawn to him by his overturning the tables in the temple after arriving into Jerusalem in messianic fashion on a donkey the previous day. It was their embrace of Jesus as a prophet that we learned in chapter 21 verse 46 had stopped the chief priests and elders arresting Jesus there and then. But as I said, the temperature was rising and rising with this particular confrontation. Now we know that Matthew's Gospel was the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, probably around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. So after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, but also to a predominantly Jewish audience. And again, I don't doubt that that shapes Matthew's presentation of events. So this gospel story of Jesus immersed in conflict, as I say, is one of the most famous and still argued about texts. To make proper sense of it, we do need to look at a few other biblical passages. So we might, for example, want to look at Isaiah 45, verses 1 to 7, which is actually the set Old Testament reading for today. It affirms both that God is the creator and Lord of all, and that God could indeed work through non-Jewish rulers, such as, for example, Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire. It's all in the midst of the exilic history of the people of Israel. And we also might wish to look to Psalm 24, verse 1, the declaration that everything there is belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and all things in it. So you can see there's already some complexity in some of the other texts that we might wish to draw into the picture. Now, by plotting with the Pharisees, as I say, the Herodians formed an unholy alliance. We've got some of the disciples of the Pharisees, so the leading figures, it seems, were not prepared to actually do the dirty work themselves. They sent their minions. And some of these Herodians coming together, we hear in verse 15, to entrap Jesus. One of the disciples of the Pharisees begins by trying to butter Jesus up. We hear in verse 16, they try to flatter him. But in verse 17, they spring the trap with this question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Now, Jesus highlights the malice and hypocrisy that was there in their flattery, as we hear in verse 18, before going on to answer their trick question. And the reason it was a trick question, the reason it was so difficult, is that if on the one hand he'd answered, yes, it is lawful to pay this tax, he would have lost credibility among the crowds. They would have seen him as just another collaborator with Rome. And don't forget, it was the crowds that had effectively kept Jesus safe at this point and stopped him being arrested. But if he said, no, it's not lawful to pay the tax to Rome, he could have been easily accused of sedition and potentially of inciting rebellion. If he had gone down that road, it would surely have led to his violent death at the hands of the Roman powers, even earlier than it actually happened. So what does Jesus do when he's been put in this no-win situation? Well, he asks one of the Pharisees' disciples if he could see the coin that's used to pay this tax, a denarius. Now, a denarius was worth about a day's pay for a labourer. And on the denarius was imprinted an image of Caesar. And it declared him, in the little text, a bit like our coins today, to be the Son of God and the High Priest. Now these things, these claims about a divine status for the emperor and this posting of his image, as it were, were both as examples of idolatry. They go against what we find in Exodus chapter 20 verse 4 in relation to not worshipping graven images. They would have been deeply offensive to the Jewish people, and there's a real contrast with what we find, for example, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 that talks about all humanity bearing the image of God. I wonder, as this text goes on, if the people who were challenging Jesus, the Pharisees here specifically, felt uncomfortable when Jesus drew attention to their complicity with Roman powers and indeed its oppressive economics by readily carrying and having to hand one of these coins. The text doesn't say, but Jesus asks them, who is it on this coin? And they readily name the emperor, as we see in verse 20, in the first part of verse 21. And in the latter part of verse 21, Jesus gives his enigmatic response. To use the King James Version for a moment, he talks about rendering unto Caesar what's Caesar's and unto God what's God's. So what's that about then? Well, unsurprisingly, there are different interpretations available to clearly what is the crux of this passage. Is Jesus following, say, Leviticus chapter 25 verse 23 or various other of the texts that we've already pointed to by saying, well, the people shouldn't really be paying anything to Caesar because everything belongs to God? Is he saying that the emperor should be paid because he's God's representative on earth? And don't forget the Isaiah reading suggesting God can work through earthly rulers outside of the Jewish people. Is it picking up, therefore, on the same thing that Paul will go on to say in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7, or Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17? Is it, as Tom Wright argues very persuasively, I think, kind of saying yes and no simultaneously, both and neither, pointing instead beyond all of that to the revolution which is the breaking in of the kingdom of God? Is this ultimately about our loyalty to God taking precedence over our loyalty to Caesar, but leaving us to ponder what the secondary obligations that we might then have actually mean for us? In other words, our obligations to that which is other than God. So is this essentially putting the ball back in the court of the crowds, perhaps even, not just the Pharisees' disciples and the Herodians, and saying essentially, well, it's for you to work it out? I think this text is very clearly not saying, as it's sometimes been used to suggest, that politics and faith somehow have nothing to do with each other. After all, time and again, we see God challenging the injustices, the economic and social injustices that were perpetuated by some within Israel. And in particular, Jesus, time and again, positions himself with those who were pushed to the margins. And his crucifixion was an inherently political execution. People were not crucified for preaching motherhood and apple pie. Nor is this little snippet suggesting, I think, that God doesn't care how we use our money. Nor is it saying that governments have to be supported no matter what. And there are real questions there about what happens when legality and morality appear to be in conflict. There was an interesting documentary recently by Chris Packham, the naturalist, who asked the question, is it time to break the law in relation to the climate crisis? Some might read this passage as saying absolutely not, but I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. I don't think we're let off the hook that easily. Note that elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus had taught about the conflict that will inevitably arise when we try and serve both God and mammon, God and wealth in a general sense, back in chapter 6, verse 24. So it gives us again another example of how things are not as clear-cut as some have tried to make them out to be by quoting this verse. being amazed, as we hear that the Pharisees' disciples and the Herodians were in verse 22, thus seems like an entirely appropriate response. So we have here undoubtedly one of the most challenging lectionary readings of the church year, and there's quite a few contenders for that crown, so it's, I think, saying something. We have a text that I think, as I say, has been misused by various people to argue for things that I just don't think you can argue from that text. I think it can be an example of far too much weight being put on one verse, and also perhaps the taking that verse out of its context, misunderstanding why Jesus said what he said. Even if we don't fall into those traps, though, there's still various ways that we could look at it. And this debate about how Christians should relate to earthly powers is a live one still, and one that still rages on across the world in different scenarios. None of this is easy. But at the heart of it, I think, is a defiance of those who would entrap Jesus when he comes to the cross and does indeed submit to the Roman powers and is brutally executed. When he opens his arms wide to embrace our broken world on that cross, it's very much on his terms, and that's crucial. So that leads us then into our questions for this week.